Good evening and welcome to the 7th Annual SF Urban Film Fest. My name is Faye Darmawi and I'm the founder and executive director of the SF Urban Film Fest. Our mission is to use film to inspire conversation and action around urban issues. And now I'd like to turn it to Jamon Franklin.
Hello everyone, and I am Jamon Franklin, the curator of tonight's program, Survival by Zipcode. I am a graduate student in UC Berkeley's concurrent Masters of Public Health and City Planning, focusing on spatial health inequities. We hope you have had a chance to view the film Cooked Survival by Zipcode, directed by Judith Helfand, as well as First It Was Them, Now It's Us, directed by Gabrielle Lurie and Manjula Varghese. If you haven't, they are available to watch during the entire week of the festival. Shortly, we will begin our panel program, but first, a few announcements. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We are presenting this land acknowledgement to promote visibility for the Ramaytush Ohlone and all American Indians living and thriving today on their ancestral homelands.
Thank you, Jamon. We're all getting used to navigating these virtual events, so unpredictable things may happen. A few panelists are dealing with extreme weather, so please, in advance, thank you for your patience. If you have any issues, please leave a message in the comment box. And now I'd like to thank all our members who are here tonight and for growing our community. If you'd like to become a member, it's easy to do so via our website. And if you'd like to donate, our festival this year is mostly pay what you can so that all can access our programs. It's also easy to donate, which is also on our website. And then quickly, I want to let you know that we have a survey that's very important for you to fill out. It's very important for us to understand who we're reaching and making sure that we're serving our diverse and wonderful audiences. And now back to our curator, Jamon Franklin. Unmute yourself.
So sorry. Thank you. Taking the message from the film that disaster is not only a sudden weather event, but also the slow-moving human-created disasters of inequality and disempowerment, we want to bring these frameworks to the current pandemic. Tonight's panel discussion was developed in response to the early mainstream narrative that COVID-19 was the great equalizer. Over the past year, we have seen that this is very much not true, as the disparities in COVID cases and deaths in the US have fallen along lines of race and class, as was predicted by most people working in health equity. We are very excited to bring some of those people here to speak with you today. We are so excited that tonight's panel will be moderated by Catherine Schaff of the Berkeley Media Studies Group. I know Kathy from the Alumni Network of the Berkeley School of Public Health and also from her work with the Public Health Justice Collective and Health Equity in the Bay Area. As a reminder, throughout the discussion, please submit your questions through the chat function on YouTube or Facebook. And thank you. Oh, I think that's it. Sorry. I'll pass it back to Faye.
And now, without further ado, our moderator, Catherine Schaff.
I think we're waiting for, oh, go ahead, Faye.
You're up, Catherine.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Schaff, and I'm very excited to be here today. I'm actually one of the people in a blizzard right now. I live in San Francisco, but I am staying with family in Washington and have no internet. So I'm going to turn the camera off. I apologize for not being visibly present, but I'm definitely here. It's just a little bit easier to hear me without the video. I am just grateful to be here, grateful for all the people tuning in. And I wanted to talk a little bit before we introduce the panelists about why we're here today. So for me, I know with COVID, some of my ways of being with people and engaging in activism has really shifted. This has brought on feelings of isolation, disconnect while we're working daily on COVID or disasters, health inequities. And for me, art and film can be one way to step back, to reflect, and to connect to each other in broader movements, and to remind us that we're not isolated, the power to create change, that people have done it before and they're doing it right now in the midst of COVID and beyond. And so I just wanted to offer gratitude to the filmmakers, the film festival organizers, everyone who's participating and watching tonight, and especially the panelists who are deep in the midst of work on COVID, on disasters, on recreating our world so it's centered on justice, equity, inclusion, and liberation. And we're still showing up here tonight. Some of them poncho in the middle of a huge storm in Houston, where everyone's legacy is being really impacted, and people are being impacted on the coldest, one of the coldest days there. The panelists are all doing deep structural work that's greatly needed to address the themes we see in the films, the slow-moving violence. And my hope for why we're here today is that we can learn from panelists, we can be challenged by them, we can be inspired by their work and the people they work with, and ultimately we can see how we're connected and how we can deepen our collective work together. Their bios are online, so I'll just briefly introduce each panelist. We'll hear from them. We have a few questions for them, and then we also want to hear from you, so you can write your questions in at any moment. Our plan is to talk until 7 p.m. Pacific time, so we can really get into the issues raised in the film and sort of honor the depth of these issues. I know we've all been on Zoom the last year. I encourage everyone to do what you need to do to stay present. Take a deep breath, close some of your computer tabs, get comfortable, and that way we can be together on this collective journey towards equity and justice tonight. The panelists have so much to say, so whatever it takes to be present, I encourage you to stay with us. So first we'll hear from Judith Helfand. She's the director and producer of Cooked: Survival by Zipcode, which hopefully everyone saw, but if not, you still haven't. This film won the Freedom of Expression Award from the San Francisco Film Festival in 2019, right in San Francisco in the It's for me, in work we got a very good documentary maker. Judith.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Like Catherine said, I'm the producer director of Cooked: Survival by Zipcode, which I made with a really wonderful team in collaboration and in partnership with Cartemquin Films in Chicago. And though the film is very much centered around the 1995 Chicago heat disaster, it seems to be more relevant than ever in terms of what happens when one big sort of horrible, very clear or not so clear, extreme disaster that everyone can agree is the disaster actually reveals the underlying disaster of the long-term impact of systemic and strategic structural racism. And that was what was so moving to me about the story when I first read about it, which it was adapted from Eric Kleinenberg's groundbreaking book about the heat disaster. And when I read it, I couldn't believe that one extreme weather event could reveal so much about a city. Little did I know that when I started the movie, that 6 weeks to the day that I would shoot the first interview, Katrina would happen. And over time, I would realize that this isn't a one-off, that this is a paradigm that we really have to look at. What happens when extreme weather actually reveals the underlying disasters that we don't really want to pay attention to until we're forced to. So this movie is an interesting case study, I would say. Right now, years after we first launched it in 2018 and then in 2019, it's playing on national television. It just played again, I think, last night, Saturday night, because it is so relevant, and because right now we are living at this moment when zip code means so much and determines so much. And the big question that I ask in the film is it possible to reframe disaster and reframe disaster preparedness? And if we do that, perhaps we actually agree that disaster is the long-term impact of structural racism, that that's the disaster, and that the disaster preparedness perhaps could be deep, deep, deep investment in the communities that we know are going to get hurt the worst and that are clearly being hurt the worst right now during COVID. So those are the things that we are thinking about as we use the film to support engagement and use the film in film festivals like this one. And I'm really eager to hear what the movie made people think about on this panel. Hello?
Okay. I will. Oh, Catherine, are you back? No, not really.
I wanted to go next to Pancho,
That was useful.
the executive director.
Hey, Kathy, let me
The
introduce
executive director of the
Pancho.
Living Hope Wheelchair Association in Houston, Texas.
Oh, there she is. Hi, I will take over for a minute. Hi, so I'm going to introduce Pancho Arguelles, and he's the executive director of the Living Hope Wheelchair Association in Houston, Texas. And yours on mute.
Hi, Faye, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel, and thank you to Judith and all the crew that made that amazing film, although it's hard to watch for all the painful realities that it describes. As Catherine was saying, my name is Pancho Arguelles. I'm from Mexico. I'm an immigrant. I live here in Houston, Texas. Have been here for the last 24 years. And I am the executive director of the Living Hope Wheelchair Association, which is an organization that was formed in 2005 by immigrants who had suffered spinal cord injuries because of workplace accidents or car accidents, or because they were victims of crime. And in a way that is very connected to the topic of this panel and to the film, they had to organize because they were suddenly the victims of a disaster, only that this disaster was a policy-created disaster. It was a decision by, at that point, the Harris County Hospital District to stop providing medical supplies like catheters, diapers, gloves, or medical equipment like wheelchairs to spinal cord injury survivors who did not qualify for Medicare, Medicaid, or who did not have insurance. So they had to suddenly come together to organize and help one another the way that all our communities do when faced with an emergency, with a disaster. No, we know because of our history that we survive as communities, as people, not just individually. And our mere existence in many cases is a testimony, a witnessing of the way our ancestors did this, coming together as community and as people to survive. As I talk to you today, we might be disconnected at any moment because I might lose electricity. As you probably have seen in the news, in all the central southern United States, with Texas at the center, is experiencing a record cold, a storm, a winter storm that is causing electricity interruption of the service. A lot of people are without electricity, and really low temperatures in the lower 20s, even in the teens, which for Texas is super extreme. We are not built, our homes are not built for this. So we are in the middle of this natural disaster. And as I have been here preparing for this panel, I have been in communication with our team, learning the situations that our members are facing to try to survive this disaster. As I said earlier, the film about the heat wave in Chicago that killed more than 700 people, and then the connections to the impact of Hurricane Katrina, and the way that the mainstream structures that respond to disasters understand disaster, was hard to watch because for me and for the people I work with, these are not issues, these are not debates, these are battles that affect the survival of our membership, our families, that are connected to concrete suffering and sickness and impacts on quality of life. And as an organization, Living Hope, we started in 2005, and the guys, the group who was directly affected, came together, started to sell flowers in the street, do raffles in churches, gather the resources, go buy some catheters and diapers, and then share them among themselves to survive. No? When you suffer a spinal cord injury, it's a catastrophic injury, and you, in many cases, require like 180 catheters a month. And the founders, the members of the group, they had to survive sometimes with 10, with 30. They have to be reusing catheters with all the terrible negative health impact that this brings to you in terms of urinary tract infections. And the risk when you don't have enough diapers or underpads, the risk of ulcers, bed sores. In general, it's an impact in your quality of life, the possibility of live a longer life. And that they were faced with this situation because a group of policy professionals decided that that was a good public policy to take, and they could do it. There was impunity in making a policy decision like that. And there was the capacity to be distant from the impact of the policy decision. It could be justified. So something that we have learned working at Living Hope, now we have grown, we're a nonprofit organization. We have been able to respond in the past year to the emergency that COVID brought to our communities. We have been supporting 200 families with emergency financial assistance. We are able now to distribute medical supplies and medical equipment every month to people who show up and they get enough catheters. We are even delivering medical equipment and supplies to U.S. citizens that are not getting what they need from Medicaid, Medicare. 2 weeks ago, we were able to deliver a wheelchair to a veteran of the armed forces that was not getting the wheelchair that she needed from the government services that she has access to. So when we started working more on the topic of disaster response, that what we call now disaster justice, when Hurricane Harvey hit and we were confronting the need I mean, the emergency of a hurricane like Harvey, no? Imagine trying to be evacuated from your house when the water is rising and you are quadriplegic. We had members who went through that situation. And as Judith was saying, the disaster revealed the deeper realities of the system. And we already knew, working with immigrant communities, a whole population that has been criminalized and made pushed out of access to basic human rights like health or identity, an ID or a driver's license, or so many things that are basic to function in society as a worker, as a person. Our community already knew this reality of being marginalized, but when the Hurricane Harvey hit, this was amplified. So we have been learning, working to respond to disaster, that our communities first have been put into these kind of cracks by policy and historical structures that marginalize working class people, people of color, people with disabilities in an extremely ableist society. And then when people are in those cracks and disaster hits, they get a stronger impact, but also when the time comes to try to access relief and resources for recovery, many barriers are put there to access that. So in our efforts to respond to disaster, we learn to try to remove those barriers. And something I like about the film is that it was done with respect to the dignity of people. And also in some of the stories there, people were talking on how hard it is to try to go get help and be under suspicion that do you qualify for it. So in our way to try to respond to disaster, whether it was Hurricane Harvey recovery or now with COVID, we act from a place of believing people that are in front of us and responding as fast as possible and being centered on honoring and acknowledging their dignity. One of the hardest things when watching the film was to see the reaction of the mayor of Chicago, the same way we saw it with the federal government after Katrina, the same way we saw it with the Trump administration during COVID, of being more concerned about doing damage control to their political interests than to do disaster response to alleviate the suffering and respond to the needs of the communities. One thing we do when we get together with other community organizations, the last year during 6 months, we participated in a training process with 40 community organizations around the country in a project that we did together with the Praxis Project and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We put together a monthly gathering of community organizers from all over the country to discuss and go deeper into this notion of disaster justice. How do we need to reframe disaster so that we can develop the capacity to diminish the impact and also to get access to recovery and mitigation and prevention resources? And one of the key aspects was the need to think of pre-existing and persistent disasters that are rooted in structures, economic, socio-political structures that privilege the needs and rights and interests and profit of a minority and exclude the needs of the majority, and particularly of people of color and and workers, people who are poor. And this need to reframe is rooted in something we know, which is our dignity, which is the fact that we have rights to live a life of abundance, to be safe, and something that's at the core on why people in power get to ignore the needs of our communities, is that there is a long tradition in this country, in this current world, rooted in colonialism, when our humanity is under suspicion. When people in power can ignore our humanity, and there is a level of impunity to that. So in our way to respond to disaster and to build community and to build organizations so that we can have power to change those structures, at the core is the acknowledgement of our shared human dignity and the acknowledgement of our right to live together with what we need, not only during disasters, but also all the time. I will just add that it's great to be having this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to what Dr. Tony and Doña Berta have to say, and to the questions from the audience. And I believe that our communities have, for hundreds of years, shown a capacity to overcome almost like apocalyptical events and come out of that with strengthened solidarity and humanity. It's hard. These are not issues. These are life and death and really hard situations that we face every day. But it's possible because we do it in a everyday level of connection to one another that allow us to help one another and also to keep the eye in what we are trying to build, a society with all people can have all rights.
Thank you, Pancho. As the film was also talking about what you're talking about, which is we have to see the underlying systemic disaster, not just a natural disaster. So I would like to introduce our next panelist, Berta Hernandez. So unmute yourself, please.
Hi, hello, I'm Berta Hernandez. I have been living in San Francisco for 30 years, and I have 2 kids that are grown up. They were born here in the city, and I'm also have been doing immigrant work advocacy for the last 30 years. I work for Instituto Familiar de la Raza as the Family Services Director, and I'm in leave right now, working for the Department of Public Health, supporting the COVID vaccination efforts. And I want to say that for what Pancho was saying, it's extremely important for me. When I came to United States, I didn't find the American dream. It was extremely more difficult than what I expected. At the same time, it's a moment that defines me before and after I crossed that border. And it gave me the sense of solidarity that I never expected from my country of origin. I'm from Mexico City, it's a big city. Coming to San Francisco and finding a small community, a multicultural community from people from Mexico, Central America, South America, we all facing particular circumstances in this particular place on the planet, and it changed everything for me. So this has been my community for the last 30 years. When I just arrived here, I couldn't believe the disparities, I couldn't believe the injustice that we were living. It's not other people, it's that I was now part of this group and I could not escape. So it was the level of poverty, the fact that, as Pancho was saying, that you stop being a human being, you are not recognized for what you know, for what you have studied, what you were in the past, what you have to bring and to this community or to this country or to this city. You are nobody, you are invisible. And so with that is also this understanding of who you are and how people look at you, the rights that you don't have. You don't have the right to work because you need the papers. It's not that clear before you came here. When you arrive here and you understand that you have no right to work, you need the papers, you need to qualify. You need the papers to be able to find medical care. You need the papers, the immigration papers, to be able to access university studies. And then you live in these crowded conditions because rent is so expensive. And through these 30 years, rent has becoming the issue more and more because houses, the rents have have been just going, I don't know, very, very, very high, impossible with immigrant salaries to pay. So families have to conglomerate in housing situations that are very crowded. So you have flats, and in each room you have a family living there with all the difficulties that can have. And also there is this, the question of not being able to move. You don't have the right to go and visit your family in your country of origin, and you are stuck here. So I have many friends and many neighbors that they have to stay here when their parents or their family members have died in their countries of origin. And it's very painful to go through that. It's also the pain of not having your children with you, and then it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and finally you are able to bring them here, and all the difficulties that entitled. So our life before COVID, it was extremely difficult at all levels. We definitely were at the lower scale of society. So our community are the community that clean the houses, that clean the restaurants, that make the food, that is invisible, but that makes this city function. So we were fighting for many, many things. And under these circumstances that the COVID epidemic encountered us. I always see what happened to our communities, that we were already in a thread, in a string, in a little hilito, and there is big scissors, COVID are the big scissors that cut that string, and the community just collapsed into the unknown. From one day to the other, people have no money to buy food, to move around. They started to lose jobs like immediately, one after the other. And you don't have the insurance from the state, so it's not unemployment or no check that came to support. It's nothing, it's zero. Those are the circumstances. And not only that, but in San Francisco, almost 50% of the people with COVID are Latino, Spanish, monolingual. That means immigrants. And so it's obviously that all the disparities of health, that all the conditions that you have for a disaster were already present. So when you have the virus, they just explode in our hands. That's what happened. And that's how we have been there in that situation since March. It has been a year. And things have not been getting better. Things continue to be really bad, and they are deepen their difficulty. So it's there is something that the director of San Francisco Public Health Grand Call of Access, he says, health emergencies exploit the inequalities in society. People with fewer resources, chronic illness, underlying health conditions, and who have experienced institutionalized stigma and discrimination are going to be the more at risk for getting sick. And definitely that's what happened. That is the situation that we are living right now. And then how do we present this to the world? From my little place in the universe here, how we tell the health officials, the organizations, the students, other communities that they don't have the same situation that we have, the situation that our community is confronting right now. It has been very difficult. I would say maybe impossible, because everybody who was working already attending to the needs of the community has continued to work with nonstop since March. I work with families in my usual job, not in COVID, it's just my regular job at Instituto. I work with families with children, young children and youth younger than 18 years old. So everybody in that milieu, in that field work, everybody was attending to the immediate needs of this community, also finding them a computer, finding for them internet, helping parents to connect to the classes in Zoom. Everybody in a room, 3 Zoom classes at the same time with no resources. So that has been the work of many workers in the city. Also the food distribution, the Pampers distribution, the formula distribution, the masks, all the PPE equipment, and also in our community we have several organizations that organize themselves very strongly. One is called the Latino Task Force, and they were able to obtain a lot of support from the city for food distribution, but also for testing in the different neighborhoods. And obviously, when the testing started, in those neighborhoods that we have our community were the highest incidences of COVID. That were the Mission District, Bayview, Hunters Point, Visitation Valley, Excelsior, out of Mission. Also communities of colors, communities with many immigrant families living there in those conditions that I was describing first. But this organization, because of the organization, the Latino Task Force, it was possible to establish different test sites in the city. Of course, with the support of the Department of Public Health and the support of the university, the UCSF, they have been doing a lot of work on that, and now in the question of the vaccination. And also the Latino organizations are putting a lot of pressure into the San Francisco Department of Public Health to give priority to the more hard-hit communities today, after, of course, the health workers and the seniors. So that's, it's complicated. That's great that people can make films. I'm happy about the film about the Bayview, because it's a way that we can tell our story, and I hope we can tell our story in our immigrant community also through those.
Thank you, Berta. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Berta. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions about how we are effective in meeting the needs in the Latino community facing COVID. So I'd like to bring to the stage our final panelist to introduce himself and his work, Dr. Tony Eighten. Yeah.
Thank you, Faye, and thank you, Pancho and Berta. I just really love listening to you and really appreciate the work that you do. And I want to try to put some larger context to this work so the audience understands some of the work that's happening to undo some of this systemic injustice. Let me start by just introducing myself. I'm a public health doctor, and I used to run the Alameda County Public Health Department. Before that, I ran a health department in Stamford, Connecticut. Now I work for a health foundation in California that invests essentially all of its money trying to undo the root causes of systemic injustice that impact health. But I enjoyed watching this movie for a couple of reasons. One, my good friend Linda Ray Murray, who was health commissioner in Chicago, was in the film, and we worked together for many years in national organizations trying to get to the root causes of systemic racism and health injustice. And the second reason is that the movie's based on the work of Eric Kleinenberg, or at least part of the work of Eric Kleinenberg, who wrote the book Heatwave. And I know Eric. After I read his book in the early 2000s, it changed my way of thinking about disasters. And if you remember back, September 11th, 2001 was 9/11, of course, but a month after that was October 11th, which was an anthrax attack in the United States. And I was working in Connecticut at the time, and a 93-year-old woman died of anthrax, which was ultimately traced through the mail. And there were only 2 postal distribution centers in Connecticut, and one of them was in Stamford, Connecticut, which is where I was the health officer. So I got swept into this enormous bioterrorism effort. And I'll never forget the image of all of these various agencies descending upon my office, the FBI, the state police. There were people from the DEA, all of these guys with guns and badges and whatnot. And they were asking me, you know, how are we going to find where this anthrax came from? Fast forward many years, and I ended up in California. One of the tasks at that time, the federal government started to put a lot of money, this was the Bush administration, into terrorism preparedness, some of which was bioterrorism preparedness, which we used to refer to as the guns and hoses, because it was basically police and fire folks that got those resources. But after October 11th with the anthrax, and then there was concern about smallpox and a variety of different engineered weapons, the federal government started to put money into public health as well. And so we ended up going to these conferences like those that were depicted in the film of these sheriffs and fire chiefs with their big trucks and various devices. And it struck me after having read Heat Wave that this was not the way that public health was going to protect vulnerable populations. If you read the book Heat Wave, one of the major takeaways from the book is that in Chicago, several neighborhoods, zip codes that had very similar demographics and income, African-American neighborhoods, low income. Some did very badly, as was depicted in the film, but there were some that seemed to be protected and didn't have nearly as many deaths. And so Kleinenberg dug into that disparity. Why are these 2 very similar looking neighborhoods having very different outcomes from this heat wave? And what he concluded was that there were social bonds and so-called social capital, connectedness amongst people in the neighborhoods that did well. And those neighborhoods that did well, despite being poor, despite being African-American disproportionately and having experienced that long legacy of redlining and apartheid, American apartheid, quite frankly, still had this resiliency that allowed them to sort of protect themselves. And so when it was my turn to design bioterrorism preventiveness strategies in Oakland, we took the lessons from Heat Wave and we actually brought the resources into West Oakland and East Oakland and invested them in community organizing. Because we felt that community organizing would strengthen the resiliency of those communities and allow them to better withstand any kind of disaster. In fact, we wrote an op-ed at the time in the San Francisco Chronicle that we called the Constant Hurricane. This was after Katrina, where we described essentially this ongoing disaster in the lives of people in communities across this country. Well, the interesting part of the story is that when the federal government found out that I was taking federal dollars and investing it in community organizing in East and West Oakland, they sent people out to talk to me to figure out what I was doing, why I was doing it. And at one point, they threatened to put me in jail. They said that I was misappropriating federal dollars. I was using it for purposes for which they were not intended. And the intended purpose was to buy more trucks and to buy all of these so-called countermeasures for a terrorism disaster, because their mindset was an acute disaster. It was something happening that was sort of unpredictable and sudden, whereas the reality was, as Kleinenberg's book pointed out, those that did well actually had day-to-day supports, day-to-day social capital, day-to-day resiliency. And the only way we knew how to build that was through community organizing. Well, lucky for me, I didn't go to jail. What happened instead was Hurricane Katrina. And after Katrina happened, people all of a sudden understood what we were talking about in Alameda County, was that it's that underlying preparedness, that the social fabric that needs to be essentially mended in these communities because of the legacy of racism, redlining, racial zoning, apartheid, in essence, that essentially tears these communities apart. And so I love this movie because it reminded me of all that. And the idea is that you can do something about it. Well, one of the other things that we did shortly thereafter in the early 2000s is we started to make these maps of communities, and we calculated, based on death certificates, life expectancy across very small neighborhoods. And we found in Oakland that there was a 22-year life expectancy difference between the Oakland Flatlands and the Oakland Hills. And that was sort of stunning for a lot of people. And it ended up being on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. It became an 8-part series in the Oakland Tribune and the Contra Costa Times. And then it contributed to this documentary called Unnatural Causes. That was a PBS documentary that is now used pretty widely in schools of public health. And the idea was that these are not natural differences. This life expectancy difference that you see of 20 years across neighborhoods in Oakland is not because people are that different. It's really because we've put them in harm's way, which is what Berta was describing. We place immigrants in harm's way. We do it knowingly. It's not like we're like, whoops, didn't know that was going to happen. We know that's going to happen, and we did that and are doing it throughout COVID-19. We place people directly in the eye of the storm. And those people, those essential workers, protect us. So we know what we're doing. This is not an accident of fate. This is very intentional policy. So we took those maps and we went across the country. We started doing the same analysis across many cities across the country. And in fact, went to Chicago, where there's a 30-year life expectancy difference across neighborhoods. We went to Cleveland, we went to Baltimore, we went to New York City, Philadelphia, Seattle, Los Angeles, everywhere we looked, we found these life expectancy differences. This is the American way. We stratify people's opportunity, which is the opposite of saying we create social vulnerability, by physically separating people from opportunity and resources. And so the people that Berta and Pancho are describing have been consciously placed in neighborhoods and in conditions that are away from opportunity and away from resources. Which takes me to my last point, which is fundamentally about policy violence, which is really kind of the opposite side of disaster justice. And if you listen to Reverend Barber, who's in North Carolina, who speaks, and I think first came up with this term of policy violence. Policy violence is generally the absence of policy in the face of abject need. It's the absence of affirmative policy when we know that policy is needed. The simplest way to describe it is look at health insurance in this country compared to virtually any other developed country in the world. There are literally hundreds of studies that show that health insurance improves people's health and protects their lives. So it's not about the evidence. The evidence is there. Yet, despite that, our politics don't allow us to essentially recognize the shared humanity across our population that would allow us to create a universal health insurance policy. And in fact, the United States lacks universal policies in general because of exactly what Pancho said, this lack of shared solidarity across groups. And we saw this manifest itself on January 6th in the Capitol, where people stormed the Capitol for fear that their tribe essentially was losing hegemony, losing control. And in their minds, they would rather burn it all down than share it because they didn't see any form of solidarity. So I just want to highlight that in public health, we approach health with this understanding. We approach health with the understanding that people are placed through policy, or oftentimes the absence of affirmative policy, they're placed in harm's way. And we can't just treat people after the storm. We have to get underneath these problems and figure out how to undo this policy. In the mindset of many Americans, health is about health care. And the paradigms for health there's three of them. One is that health is about your behaviors. Whether you smoke, you drink, you drive without a seatbelt, you have sex without condoms, you're doing something wrong. And the job of the healthcare system is to fix your behaviors. A second paradigm is that health is transactional, meaning that it's the quality or the frequency of healthcare services. If you have a good doctor, you have access to fancy pharmaceuticals or CAT scans and PET scans, you'll do well. If you don't, well, you're kind of on your own. And then the third is that health is essentially genetic, and it's a lottery. Some people have good genes, some people have bad genes. The people with the bad genes, well, we can try to fix them up in the healthcare system, but it's kind of just bad luck. And what we've recognized in public health is that all three of those paradigms are largely wrong. They don't explain 22-year life expectancy differences across the city of Oakland. And what we've recognized is that health is political. When I say political, I mean small p political. One definition of politics is it's the struggle over the allocation of limited and precious social goods. And that may mean something, as was pointed out in the movie, like a grocery store in your neighborhood or a park, or the quality of your schools, or even potable drinking water. We assign access to those health protective resources based on our overall perspective on the value of the people in those neighborhoods. That's how bad it is. We stratify access to fundamental health resources based disproportionately in this country on race because of its long and pernicious history of racism and apartheid. And until we recognize that and start to undo that, we will continue to have the Katrinas and the Chicago heat waves and the foreclosure crisis and the HIV crisis and COVID-19 manifesting themselves in the same way, stripping the veneer off of our society's racism and structural injustice. So I love this film because it tells that story. And I love Pancho and Berta because they're doing the work to undo this. So I'm happy to hand it back to our moderators.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony Eighten. I'm going to call all the panelists back on the stage. And I loved seeing everybody back on the stage. Kathy, our moderator's internet is still intermittent, so I'm still going to be your moderator, your guest moderator. Thank you. I'm humbled. And the private chat between the panelists is going off the hook. So I'm just going off script. Sorry, sorry, Kathy. I'm just going to go around the room and have folks respond to what Dr. Eighten said, because you guys have a lot of things to say because the private chat's going off the hook. I'm going to go first to Pancho.
Well, that was really powerful about Berta and Dr. Tony. And I'm going to confess I had a hard time when I was talking because I couldn't see any other face with mine. So it felt really weird and I was getting very disconcentrated. So this is great. I can see your beautiful faces now, which is at the core of the ethical demand, no? Emmanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian philosopher, insists on how at the end of the day, philosophy and ethics are about seeing the face of the other. Not seeing your face in the face of the other, seeing the face of the other and being able to connect to that. And that goes to the definition of politics. Another definition of politics is the art of what's possible. And under that definition, if it is not possible to some sector in society that are rooted in fear and white supremacy, to see my face and see my humanity and to see the face of Black people and Native people and people with disability and women and LGBTQ and all the people who don't conform the dominant group, it is not possible to see that and see their humanity and not to see their own fear, then the margin of what's possible under that politics is very little, and we're not going to survive that. So it comes down also to how to build enough power to transcend that without destroying them. It's not about that or replacing. Yeah, it's replacing the paradigm where we can live beyond that trap of fear. One thing I really love of this panel right now is I love a public health professional that can see the evidence and is not afraid of naming the crime. Because we, as an organization that works on public health for survival, I mean, our programs are run by immigrants in their wheelchairs. We are in our meetings, and you have our team of 12, 13 people who don't have salaries or benefits. They just get a stipend, and they are the one running the programs, managing the diaper, I mean, the catheters, the wheelchair, going to pick them up, giving it to people. As English learner, managing to do that, and it's humbling and it's amazing, but it's also really hard to know that our members, our team, live in pain because of lack of access to basic, they have access to healthcare in Harris Health, and we're grateful to the doctors, nurses, all this, but still the right is not there. The good taking care of people is not there. And in that constant suffering and pain, it's very hard to try to provide the services and win the policies, and at the same time build the power to change the structures. And what is amazing is, despite all of those challenges, we keep being able to do that. And on top of that, respond to disasters. So even as discouraging as it can be to look at the size of the 500-year colonial system that we're still facing with these structures of exclusion and oppression and this apartheid and everything, it is great to see that these communities come together and are able to change policy like we did with Metro Lift during COVID to respond to the everyday survival needs of people. Imagine if you are in a wheelchair and suddenly you were depending on a food distribution site to get food every week. And now they're saying the only way you can get that is because you need to drive. And then how are you going to go to the food pantry? And we were able to work with that government entity because we have been doing policy and pushing and actions, and they adapted their service to respond to that need. So there is hope that we can change systems, and there is hope that we can change the whole thing if we come together. But it's rooted in this, and I finish with this, acknowledging the knowledge, the experience, the expertise of those who are facing the problems every day, and follow that leadership. The Zapatistas in Chiapas tell us that being a leader is to command by obeying. Experience is expertise. And honoring the wisdom and knowledge from those who have been surviving this as communities and as people for a long time is the source to a paradigm, a vision that can really change things.
Wow, thank you so much, Pancho. I'm ready. Let's go. Berta, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, first, really thank you to Dr. Tony. It's a pleasure to have a public health professional that speaks the truth. It's for me, it has been a journey of knowing my own community, knowing the problems year after year, fighting oppression and trying to understand where I stand. It's very complicated. To have a person who is telling us the things so clear is amazing, and also to know that you stood your ground, and you also have to face persecution. So I just want to thank you for being so honest and being a true health professional. And I also want to touch on what Pancho was saying in terms of 500 years of colonialism, because it's talking about the root causes. This is our root cause, very deep. We stand on a land that was stolen from nations that were destroyed. And then we took, I didn't, some people here took people from another continent and enslaved them to bring them here. And then they continue to do that in terms of stealing the land. When we talk about immigrants, Mexican immigrants, for example, and we stand in California, that this is also a stolen land, taken by the Army of US in the Mexican capital. That's how it happened and how the last treaties were signed. So it's those are the root causes of the expressions of the COVID in our communities and other health issues, of course. And I think that it's important to say it. It's important to say that it's racism, oppression, inequality, disparities, institutional violence, and this social vulnerability by enforcing history of oppression, of discrimination. So that's how we have been put in this particular place. And I will say it's extremely important and extremely difficult to fight. Because how do you fight against 500 years of oppression? How do you fight of the powers to be right now? How do you change? Because it was not only Trump. Trump is gone, but all the structures of oppression and exploitation continue to be here. It's we are just fighting an epidemic. Sometimes I was talking with my daughter. I'm going to finish, but because I'm going to bring long stories. But I was talking with her about what's the solution to all of this. And I was saying, if I was the mayor of San Francisco, I will declare everybody go to their houses. No more people that don't have to go outside, don't go outside. You will have an income. Nobody's going to pay rent. Nobody's going to pay the mortgage. We figure it out. How are we going to do this? All the Safeways, they are under control of the city. Food distribution for everybody. We pay the Safeways. I mean, there is like major solution that need to happen because we continue to be in a big hole. So those are the type of solutions. Nobody's going to listen to me, maybe, I don't know. But I'm just saying, I was saying to my daughter, something that radical is the only thing that is going to stop this epidemic or the continuation of other epidemics, because we are just already put all the necessary conditions for them to occur. This is a big one, but maybe another one coming and another one coming, and we need to stop it. So I just wanted to say that. Sorry.
Thank you. No apologies. Berta, we're getting comments that people are supporting you to become the next mayor. with that edict. So Judith, how would you like to respond?
Well, first of all, I'm just so humbled to be a part of tonight's panel, and very, very humbled by what you're doing, Pancho, by the work that you do every single day, Berta, by your courage, Doctor, by everything that you said. And I just want to say, I mean, you know, in the movie, we kind of go, I go all the way into the world of disaster preparedness, and I really go deep down, like, because it's so bizarre to me that we have this amazing infrastructure that is so hyper-local and so well organized now that that somehow I just thought, you know what, if we retrofitted this and we used the money to buy the trucks, instead of buying those trucks, and we invested in the new brand of first responders, whoever they may be, and they would be a Pancho, and they would be Berta's organization, and they would basically be doing everything that you were doing that you got in trouble for. You know, we would be addressing the long-term impact of structural racism and utilizing the disaster preparedness infrastructure. If that's, and if we wanna, and if it makes people uncomfortable to say that the long-term impact of structural racism is the culprit, then fine, call it disaster preparedness. And what has happened in the last year and a half that's been so fascinating, and the reason what we're trying to do with this movie right now is to support this movement that understands that language is powerful and that sometimes you just have to play with words. So that whole new movement that is redefining racism as a public health crisis, which is taking place all around the country. There's over 150 jurisdictions that are doing that. And I think they're trying to do that because they know that there's policy underneath those declarations, and that if you change it, then you could actually maybe move that money around. And instead of using the money to buy the same old disaster preparedness stuff, maybe you could invest in Pancho's organization and reframe that social cohesion as frontline response in the midst of COVID that is really worthy of that level of investment every single day. So, you know, I think that I'm so excited and jazzed to hear what you're saying, Doctor, because we've been throwing that out there because I actually think that there's all this money at the local county level that is used all the time for disaster preparedness that could be retooled very, very, very easily. And I might be very naive to think that, but I actually don't think it's so bizarre. And that instead of waiting for all the federal money, I mean, you know, that there are hyper local solutions, and that there is investment that can happen in the same way that we're talking about, you know, reallocating the, you know, money for police. We can reallocate the world of disaster preparedness and use it for investments in radically different ways and be addressing systemic racism at its root causes. I just think that, so that's something that we're trying to, you know, use the bizarre nature of the world of disaster preparedness and this movie to try to help support those conversations at the policy level and in communities where there are people like you who might get in trouble for doing that kind of really cool thing that you did that you almost got in trouble for.
It's amazing, the word policy violence and the imagery in your movie too, Judith, where our definition of disaster preparedness is very militaristic. All your scenes of the military, that's how we define disaster preparedness. And it's exactly like policy violence that Dr. Tony Eighten was talking about. Dr. Eighten, did you want to respond to what Judith was saying? I saw your head nodding.
I can only agree. I mean, it's another one of the reasons I enjoyed seeing this movie is that it's sort of, we felt so alone in what we were doing, you know? And you know, the impetus for it was similar to the movies. It was basically, I read the book Heat Wave, you know, right when it came out, and I was like, holy cow, this is really important. And I think that the, you know, at the end of the day, when you analyze this work, you recognize that racism is driven by a narrative. It's driven by a story of who we are as Americans, who matters, you know, who built the country, you know, who deserves kind of credit and profile. And that narrative, you know, is an exclusionary narrative. In essence, it dehumanizes the target of the narrative. You know, when the last president, you know, was announcing his candidacy for the presidency, you know, down the golden escalator and stood up there and he talked about Mexican Americans as bringing drugs, bringing crime, being rapists. Now, most of us who saw that were like, wow, goodbye, you know, your candidacy is over. And 70 million people got excited about that. There's a story behind that, which is essentially about tribalism. It's about people feeling like we're in a zero-sum competition for these limited goods, and whatever they get means they have to take it from us. And the good news about that is that there is actually a competing narrative that has, you know, has actually been in ascendancy in this country at times throughout our history, and is in ascendancy in California. I don't know, I doubt, Pancho, it's in ascendancy in Texas, but who knows? But in California, we have a narrative of inclusion. It's not a perfect narrative, but it's led to policy changes, like the inclusion of undocumented people in healthcare, at least undocumented children, and we're pushing for undocumented seniors and all undocumented people. Undocumented people can also get driver's licenses in California, can go to college and get in-state tuition, can become lawyers, become doctors, and take the bar and practice. We've done a lot on boys and men of color to create policies to reduce school suspensions and expulsions. We've cut them in more than half in the past 6 years in California. But California has done great things on bail reform. All of that is driven by a narrative of inclusion, seeing the full humanity of the people who Donald Trump targeted in his announcement for presidency. And so that's why I particularly like this movie, because it gets to that root, which is the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And until we can change that story and tell the true story of who we are, we're going to be stuck in these policies that exclude people. And so storytellers are really, really, really important in this movement. And I appreciate the effort that you made to tell this story.
Thank you, Dr. Eighten. Judith, did you want to respond, and then we can go to Pancho?
Well, when I started this, I wasn't in it. I started it in 2003, and it was going to be an open and shut case about a heat wave. And 6 weeks to the day that we started shooting, Katrina happened, and it became clear like that wasn't going to be the case. And then one thing led to another, and we started to really look at the lifespan gap and look at the work of Dr. Whitman, and somehow it led me into this world of disaster preparedness, and it made me decide that it was really important to insert my voice and sort of take the white community on this journey and really push the white community to kind of look at the survival by zip code story and really question, are we comfortable with letting this country be cooked, or are we committed to trying to do something about it? So I appreciate your appreciation for the storytelling, but now we're trying to use it.
Exactly. Pancho, did you want to contribute to this discussion?
Yes, well, there's two things. This last part of, there is a narrative that dominates, and when we shift the narrative, it's like this complex connection that the narrative shifts because there's people, there are hands in the ground weaving and building community, building organizations and building power. And it's this constant balance of trying to win policy, but winning, it's not just about the campaign, it's how you use the campaign to build actual power, not just to move the elected official to do what you want them to do, but actually to get elected officials that look like you and come from your community. And in that sense, there is hope in Texas. We have been living under a regime that was very similar to the last 4 years. We have been living in Texas for 12 years under something like that. The Tea Party controlling the House, both sides, and the governorship, and policies that are just criminalizing and punishing the poor and like centered on white supremacy and exclusion. So we weren't freaking out when the last president won, when Trump won. We were like, oh, we know it was going to be a lot worse, but we have been facing that in terms of evil, ugly policies like refusing billions of dollars for Medicaid expansion because it was Obamacare money, and how much people suffer just because of that electoral ideological position on public health policy. So the shift of the narrative has to be rooted on this weaving of actual power, organizations, and a movement led by the directly affected people. And we're seeing that, like here in Harris County, a 28-year-old immigrant woman, Lena Hidalgo, was elected county judge 2 years ago, and she's making an amazing difference in every disaster, in everything. So in that sense, there is hope on how this changed. I really love also the way Judith described like how she got into something and it ended becoming something else, because that's also at the core of what we do. And I face that constantly doing the work with Living Hope. Or before that, with the Worker Center, we founded to work with day laborers who are also constantly abused after every disaster hits. We know that after the disasters comes the abuse. If you're a day laborer, you go clean up after the hurricane, they're not going to pay you all this. But one thing that I have been very clear during COVID is we don't do what we do because we know or because we can. We do it because it's needed for the survival of our community and because we love our communities. So you got out to try to tell a story about the heat wave, and you were taken somewhere else because you have something in your heart and you were making yourself of service to something bigger. And it has to land on that. And the last thing I want to say quickly is a constant thing that we have been learning and facing doing this work with Living Hope in the intersection with disaster is how outrageous it is that for FEMA and the Red Cross and so many disaster response organizations, every time there is a disaster, they act surprised that there is people with disabilities that are going to face different kind of barriers. And we have had the luck of connecting with the Inclusive Disaster Strategies Partnership. These people with disabilities who have been working on this for years, and we saw the frustration and the anger and the great work they do, and they actually go and solve things. And we also learned there that we are in an intersection as Living Hope, that when we go to disability spaces, we are the only ones talking about immigrants. And then when we go to immigrant rights spaces, we are the only ones talking about immigrants with disabilities. And that is a sector that is also going to keep growing in the next few years. And it's going to require very direct effort like they're doing in California to include, like you include the kids, now to include the elderly and the immigrant with disabilities, so that this society doesn't just throw away workers once their body break, like they just throw them away. And we cannot do that and try to become a democracy at the same time. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It has been amazing.
Berta, did you want to respond from what your experience has been on the ground in terms of the San Francisco response?
I think that to me something that has been very amazing to me was to see the solidarity. I was saying that the most difficult thing in my life was to cross that border. I never expected what I found here. And also the most incredible thing I found was the solidarity networks that you have among the more dispossessed and disenfranchised people. Everybody. It's always there, it always has been there, but when COVID hit, as everything went to, I don't know where, to the bottom of life, many people started to collaborate immediately for the survival of their neighbors, immediately. And that's how we have survived, because the state took weeks to be back on the ground. Community was on the ground the next day. It was not stopped. Staff and volunteers non-stop, and has been a year without stopping. I think that the other thing that to me was very important, I was really busy with my food and other things, but I was looking on my way how different organizations in the community started to form this coalition, the Latino Task Force, and how instrumental they were in the deploy of the testing and now the vaccination neighborhood. We are doing neighborhood vaccination clinics, waiting for the supply, of course, because we all know that there is no sufficient, but building the infrastructure and the skills, the tools that we need when we have all the supplies and be able to vaccinate. But all of that was a push from the communities asking for it. And I think that's extremely important, something that I discovered in this epidemic. The different powers at the city, they have done their job as city workers and entities of the city. I work for one. I don't want to get fired, but no, they did their share. I mean, the hospitals, the attention to the people with COVID. We have one of the we have less hospitalized people in this city than in other cities that are equally compressed in terms of demographic, people living together. So there is a lot of success in terms of how the epidemic was handled from those entities. But I think that were the community organizations, the ones who really mark the path. This is where we have to go. And this city has that experience with the AIDS epidemic. It was the gay community in this city who really led the fight. Then was the Black Coalition on AIDS, the Filipino Coalition on AIDS, the Latino Coalition on AIDS, the harm reduction with the drug users. Everybody started to mobilize themselves, but it was initially the gay community with a lot of power. And I think that shaped the response of the city. And now it's very, this organization, mostly Chicano organization, and I am very grateful for them. I have my 2 Chicano kids, how they were able to advocate for our community, because the immigrant community, what can I tell you? I don't know. I was an advocate for 30 years. Right now, I was not an advocate. I was surviving because people around me were dying of hunger, or they were dying of COVID, or they were testing positive and they had to live together in the same house because there is no way to go. I mean, those were my situation at that point. I didn't was a political activist anymore. It just stopped for me. There was a question that we asked these panelists in preparation to this of my story. How do I tell my story? I just stopped telling my story with COVID. And I'm a poet, I'm a theater person. I just stopped telling my story. I could not move. I stopped being an advocate and an activist because the disaster is so deep that the only thing I could do was to be in the disaster. And that has been a year. So I'm very grateful for other sectors of the community that were not as oppressed as the immigrants, who took in their hands the direction of the response of the city, and the city collaborated with them in terms of how to address the problems, the many, many, many complex problems of this city, because the only thing I know now is this city. I don't even read the newspaper anymore. It's just like, it's not even the whole city. It's the Excelsior, the Mission, Bayview, Visitation Valley. That's it. Tony Dale. That's my new world, my new life.
Solidarity forever. We have a few more minutes and want to give everybody a chance for closing remarks. What's the call to action to our individuals out in San Francisco and other places? People who are in part of a community, people who are not part of a community, what can we do? What's your call to action? Oops, do we lose Pancho? Oh my goodness. Oh shoot. So Judith?
I mean, I guess I would say, I think that the organizations that are doing the rapid response work right now are the ones to be supportive of. But I think that they have bigger ideas than just right now the rapid response work that they're doing to address COVID. I think that the on the ground solutions that link up, food justice, land reclamation, housing, buying housing, public education, and really investing in public the anchor institutions, that's where it's at. I mean, that's where it's always at. That's where it was when people were dying because of lifespan gap, and that's what's going on right now because of COVID. So, I see that level of like major investment and support and innovation as the answer to the disaster policy problem.
Thank you. Dr. Eighten, and then we'll close off with Pancho.
Yeah, I think that there's a policy window that's opening right now. as a result of COVID-19. And, there are sort of limited times in our history when we've seen a policy window like this open. You can look at, around the world for the times when countries really kind of built their social contracts. They were really in the wake of some shared disaster, where there was shared vulnerability across the whole society, and therefore there were the ingredients for solidarity. Everybody understood that we all could have been impacted. Whether that is the case in the United States in 2021 with COVID-19 is an open question. And how long that policy window will stay open is another open question. How we behave moving forward, recognizing how vulnerable we were. We collapsed as a country under COVID-19. We got everything wrong. I could go through the list, but we got every fundamental aspect of our response wrong. What do we learn from that? What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that we've got to actually invest in our social contract to take people out of harm's way. We've got to invest in healthcare for our undocumented people and our immigrants and our essential workers. We have to invest in wage protection for them, sick leave. We have to invest in fundamental infrastructure like housing for people who don't have a place to actually even isolate from disease. These are just some of the simple things that a civilized country has as part of its social contract. We are not a civilized country as of 2021. We're still working on trying to figure out how to live together in a civilized way, and we haven't gotten there. And there's so many other countries in the world that have. So I think to answer the question, what can you do? Get on the phone or the internet or whatever it is you do, get to your legislator and pound on them to make the kind of policy investments, to introduce the kind of policy like my legislator is doing here in California, to essentially reweave our social contract, to take people out of harm's way. We can do it. Countries around the world are doing it today. There's nothing unusual about it. We have just chosen not to do it because we've devalued people in our population, and because we're still living in this narrative of exclusion that created all of the injustice that we described earlier, all the way back to dispossessing Native Americans of their land. So we've got to fix this. We can rebuild our social contract in this country, but it's going to require leveraging this policy window at this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Eighten. Pancho, closing out?
Everything they say, and two things. One is that passage, this last part by Tony, is that's possibly we really commit to a transition to democracy, because we're not one yet. And that is a fight that has to be fought and won first at the local level and from them up. And it's going to take a while, but really, what can you do? Like the person who asked, what can we do? Commit to be part of the fight for a transition to democracy and participate, belong, join in solidarity, and also explore. It goes beyond elections. It's democracy lives in a mutual aid groups, community, cultural work, storytelling, art, everything. That's an essential. That's one. The second one is take care of yourself. We're still in the pandemic. Remember that the most important tool you have for this fight, for you and your community, is you as a human being. And for those who are in the front line, and we see the suffering and sometimes we feel overwhelmed, remember that maybe what we do is not enough, but we are enough. And communicate that to the people who are trying to walk this road with you. Because if we're going to have hope, we have to have memory. Because we didn't get here by ourselves. We got here because our ancestors fought and won because we are here.
Wow. So I feel like tonight was medicine for me and for the audience, for the festival community. I'm so humbled and appreciative of all your work. Every day you put yourself out there, and we thank you so much for joining us tonight. And everyone, please take care, as Pancho says. So we put everybody's email, contact information and resources in the chat, so the audience can follow you and learn more about your work. Tomorrow we will have more events. Tuesday, February 16th at 5:30 is a watch party called Times Like These, an Inflection Point for Food in Our Cities. And on Wednesday, February 17th at noon, we have another watch party, Storytelling Within the Political Machine, examining the California ballot Proposition 15 ads. And also just another reminder to fill out our SF Urban Film Fest survey. Crystal's going to put it in the chat. And if you like the event tonight, please spread the word of the festival. Tag us at SF Urban Film Fest. Again, thank you for the amazing panelists, Judith, Pancho, Berta, and Dr. Tony Eighten. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you so much.